Hi everyone, Alice Zhao here from Maven Analytics. If you haven't heard, we've just launched our much anticipated Cloud Fundamentals course, and I'll be sitting down with instructor Chris Bruehl today to talk about what data scientists and analysts need to know about the cloud. Hi Chris, congrats on the new cloud course.
Thanks. Yeah, I was really excited to get this one out the door. It was really fun to work on, but I also had to get it out before I went on my honeymoon for 3 weeks. So, bit of a scramble at the end, but it was worth the effort, not only because we needed a cloud course, but also because then I could really enjoy my honeymoon without thinking about what I need to get done when I get back.
Well, congrats on the course and the honeymoon. It's a very exciting time for you. Well, since this course launched a few weeks ago, it's currently one of our most popular courses on the Maven platform. Are you surprised by that at all?
Yes and no. I mean, a lot of my courses are pretty technical Python courses, which tend to be, towards the end of an analyst or data scientist, tool journey. So those courses are much less popular than this cloud course, which is, really nice to have a top course versus a more obscure technical course. I'm not too surprised in the sense that we've had tons of students over the years asking for content on the cloud, but it is nice to see that validated once we actually release a course and see a lot of folks jumping into it. And it helps that it's a bite-sized, hour and a half course on the basics, but really excited to see, as we dip our toe further into these waters, if we continue to see that excitement around the cloud.
So let's talk a little bit more about that. We'll start with the basics. What is the cloud and why is it useful?
Yeah, I mean, if I were to describe the cloud in just a few words, I would just say it's a really big computer that you access via the internet. Of course, it's a little bit more complicated than that. But when we think about the cloud, what we're thinking about are these, third-party companies, or sometimes just these massive data centers owned by a single company that serve as a huge pool of the same resources that you have on your laptop. So your processor, your hard drive, your RAM, et cetera. But the scale is enormous. And so not only do you get access to a much bigger pool of computing resources that you'd have on your local machine, but they also tend to have benefits in terms of reliability and scalability. So whereas, if you were trying to set up your own server farm or cloud system on your own, you have to make this massive investment into hardware, and that hardware is always going to be getting obsolete. But when you move to the cloud, you if you're working with a provider like AWS, let's say Amazon Web Services, they're going to handle all of the hardware for you. And if you needed, let's say, 10 terabytes of storage, all you have to do is basically click a button and you'll have access to that and you can start using it almost instantly. And if you don't need that storage, you can just say, hey, I don't need this anymore. You'll stop paying for it. And then Amazon will allocate that to somebody else. So just think about it as this highly scalable set of computing resources, similar to what you have on your laptop, but just immense scale that makes it very easy for companies to tap into the large quantities of computing power that they need to run their business.
That makes sense. That's a nice little bite-sized summary. I would say personally, as someone who got into the data field over a decade ago, I always hear about these new cloud technologies like AWS and so on. And I feel like it's rapidly evolving and it's kind of hard to keep track of it all. Do you feel that as well?
Yes and no. I mean, at the end of the day, as long as you just remember that these tools are fundamentally extensions of your local computing power and just huge pools of computing resources, yes, there are always going to be, slightly new technologies or slightly improved bells and whistles, as well as they have a lot of applications and specific services that, might help you pull in streaming data versus static data. But at the end of the day, these tools are just the same workflows and the same types of data management and storage and access that you would have in a non-cloud environment. But they do tend to move pretty quickly in terms of the terminology, which can get very confusing. But if you do understand the basics, which we cover in this course, it'll be a lot easier to keep up with those changes. So as somebody who was in your shoes, I remember hearing about cloud when my company was still on, an on-prem server. And it was, it seemed like just all these magical concepts. But once I started working with the cloud and getting my hands dirty, it really started to be a lot easier to keep up with. I mean, so many of these tools are very, very specific to, an industry or a very specific type of data workflow. And that's something that data engineers in particular really need to keep a pulse on. But typically speaking, if you're more on the analyst or data scientist side, you don't need to keep up with all of that specific terminology and tools. You really just need to have a strong understanding of what the cloud is and how to access it. But generally speaking, as an analyst or data scientist, you'll be just querying an SQL database in the cloud versus an SQL database on your local machine or on-prem server. It'll feel very similar. There are a few extra steps to get there, but I think one of the biggest things is to remember that unless you are a data engineer, you just need to really understand the basics here.
Got it. Yeah, that was my next question. Is like, as a data scientist or an analyst, like, what is my experience working with the cloud? Like, really, it looks the same to me on my computer, but then it's just I'm connecting to like AWS versus local servers.
Yeah, for the most part. I will say that data scientists often need to have a little bit more knowledge than an analyst because sometimes, depending on the role, they are responsible for building out, I would say, like prototype architecture. But let's talk about the data analyst really quickly. So, if you use Power BI, you might be familiar with a tool called Power BI Service, which is a totally browser-based version of Power BI. That's 100% cloud-based technology, but it will feel very similar to working with Power BI Desktop. There are a few, differences between the software, but if you've mastered Power BI Desktop, it'll feel very easy to get started with Power BI Service. There are a few additional, pieces and how often am I going to refresh the data? How do I connect to my cloud database that you'll need to, learn specifically for your company? But a lot of these things will feel very similar. And oftentimes they're higher performance because as opposed to your, Power BI desktop, which that dashboard is only going to be available to you when you have your machine running, you know, when it's hosted in the cloud, anybody can access your dashboards 24/7. On the data scientist side, particularly if you're going to deploy a model, you might need to start learning things like containerization. You might even use something like ML flow. But again, understanding the basics of the cloud makes it very easy to understand where these specific tools you need to learn kind of fit into that process, and it makes it feel much more manageable than if you just one day get thrown into the cloud and have to figure it out once you're in the Amazon console, for example.
So can you talk to us about some of these, I would say like tools or terms? Like I always hear things like AWS or Snowflake thrown out there. Just like at a high level, what are some things that like we would need to know as a data scientist or data analyst just to have a good conversation with someone?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to know like what I call the big three in the course. So the big three cloud providers are Amazon, which has Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, which has Azure, and Google, which has Google Cloud Platform. And all three of those providers, I think, make up almost 70 to 75% of what we call the public cloud market. These are just these pools of resources that anybody can access versus a private cloud, which is where your company would have its own data center exclusive for that. But in terms of the public cloud, AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud are the dominant three players. And all three of these players have very similar sets of tools. They have some pros and cons, but for the most part, you'll find more similarities than you'll find differences between them. And as part of developing this course, I got into each platform and played with them, and I found it really easy to set up very similar workflows, even with limited knowledge of those platforms. It is important to know who the big three players are, but I will say, if you are a data professional, I wouldn't worry about trying to master all three of them. If you understand one, that knowledge will map to another. Those are sort of comprehensive providers. But then you have a tool like Snowflake, which is what's known as a data platform. And so Snowflake doesn't actually have the computing infrastructure behind it. Snowflake will be layered on top of the hardware of AWS, Azure, or Google. So they don't own the processors, the hard drives, but Snowflake is a very highly performant data warehouse. And Google, Amazon, Azure all have their own equivalents to Snowflake. But Snowflake does tend to stand out in terms of high performance analytics at scale. But the big three are trying to catch up in terms of features offered, et cetera. But from an analyst perspective, a tool like Snowflake will feel very comfortable because it's a lot of SQL scripting. Of course, again, the big three also have those as well.
Got it. Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Like someone who is familiar with MySQL, how difficult would that transition be to using Snowflake? And it sounds like it's quite similar.
Yeah, it's quite similar. I mean, and just to be clear, I'm not an expert in Snowflake, so I might be missing some of the nuances from an analyst perspective. I haven't used it, on the job on a daily basis, but having built a demo for this course, once you get your data set up in the data warehouse, from the analyst or data scientist perspective, there is an SQL scripting window, and from there you're able to query just like you did before. It feels very comfortable. You open it up in a browser. You don't need to install something on your desktop. You just need to have the right credentials to get started with scripting. And if you're a Python user, it's pretty cool because they also have notebooks that allow you to connect to the data warehouse as well. So if you prefer to do your analysis in Python or want to get visualizations within the Snowflake platform, it's really easy to do as well. So it's really cool and fun to work with, and I hope to get the opportunity to work with it more as well.
Okay, so what I'm hearing from all this is that while the cloud might sound a bit intimidating from an analyst or data scientist perspective, it's really familiar, like in terms of the UI, but then just in the back end, there's something else happening that's a lot more capable than our current local servers.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of the things that data engineers, as well as these big three platforms, have been very careful and smart about is that ultimately they need to make sure that as many people can use them as possible. So they're not trying to create new systems that make it, Alice, your company just transitioned to AWS. You need to learn an entirely new tool. They're trying to meet the users where they were before their company transitioned to the cloud. So if you're using MySQL at your old company, there's going to be a cloud solution that allows you to use MySQL. If you're using Postgres, all of these big providers allow you to do that as well. And so it's really, yeah, it's really designed to meet analysts and other data professionals where they are. Of course, again, the caveat is that if you're a data engineer, you need to be studying these concepts more closely and understanding the best practices to make sure that the solution that your company chooses in the cloud is right for your use cases.
Okay, but that's good to hear. I mean, it sounds like once you take a fundamentals course, if you have that existing analyst or data scientist knowledge, then you don't have to be an expert at any of these things. You can really dive in and start using them day to day.
Yeah, and speaking from experience, throughout my data science career and moving into my more educational career, I've worked with a variety of cloud platforms, and there certainly is a couple of days of friction as you have to relearn where everything is and the unique quirks of a given cloud platform. But usually the biggest hurdle is one company I might have been using Microsoft's SQL, and the next company is using Postgres or MySQL or Oracle SQL, and so I find that the hurdle is a couple of days, but there's usually other more critical data related things that are a bigger hurdle. And usually the biggest one of all is just understanding what data your company has, your star diagrams, how all the tables relate to each other, and what fields mean. But yeah, it might take a day or two to really, feel like, okay, I know where to go, I know how to get into my cloud console, etc. But it's a pretty low burden, and you can learn it pretty quickly on the job if you do have that basic understanding.
Okay, that's good news to many data professionals out there. So let's back up a bit and I'm curious, what made you decide to create this course?
Yeah, so I mentioned it a bit earlier, but we have, avenues for students to provide us feedback or ask for new features. And one of the, constant drumbeats we've gotten, probably once a month is we want to know more about the cloud. I think something like 70% of Fortune 500 companies use the public cloud, and like 90+% are using some version of the cloud. So when you add all that up, most data professionals are already working with the cloud or are going to be working with the cloud soon. And I don't see that trend stopping anytime soon. So a lot of people just want to know. And so that was a big motivating factor. And for me, it was kind of a pleasure to, I've learned a lot about the cloud on the job, but it was also a great time for me to sit down and really formalize my knowledge and set it out in a curriculum for others to learn from as well. But yeah, both. It's a very critical part of the tech world in general, data aside, but especially in the data world. So getting to dive into that was really exciting.
So when you were developing this course, was there anything that was really interesting or surprising?
I mean, I don't know if I would necessarily say interesting or surprising. I mean, one of the nice things about working on this course compared to some of the longer technical courses I put together is that it was very bite-sized. But it's also much more conceptual. It's 100% conceptual versus my other courses, which are much more applied. And so it was really fun to get to dig in with the team and work on creating, really visually appealing and interesting diagrams that help solidify these pretty abstract concepts. So I got to work with Enrique, who doubles as both a learning experience designer as well as an instructor here at Maven, and come up with some really fun visuals that sort of clearly represent what's going on in the cloud. And it was fun in the process to kind of walk them through my rough diagrams. Enrique makes them much more beautiful than what I can put together. I'm not a very visually gifted person in that sense. But it was cool seeing them like both Enrique and Chris Dutton be like, oh, that's what's going on in the cloud and stuff like that, and cement their knowledge as we were kind of reviewing um, what the cloud was in some of those initial lessons. So that was pretty rewarding and fun to see their eyes kind of light up when it clicked for them.
That's one of my favorite things about working on Maven courses is both you and I come from this technical perspective where we know all the nitty-gritty of the technical pieces, but then Chris and Enrique just make everything beautiful and understandable for everyone else. So I think it's like a perfect mismatch. Not
Well, and to be
mismatch, perfect.
clear,
Yeah.
they have technical expertise in
Oh
their own
yeah,
set of
absolutely.
skills, but when we're coming from the data science world, or a cloud here, like they're coming at it with a fresh set of eyes, and the fun part and the goal is to make it click for them because they're I would say roughly at the level of understanding of the cloud that a lot of our students are. They may have worked with it or they have a vague understanding of it, and so when we get to cement those concepts or the data science concepts to them as we're walking them through our outlines and curriculums and seeing the aha, it means we're on the right track in terms of how we're teaching this material for sure. But I just wanted to point out that we're technical, but they're technical, but our
Yes.
technical, yes, is a different part of that Venn diagram, I guess.
Yeah, we're technical, they're technical, and they're great at making things
Yes,
cohesive and visually beautiful.
yes,
Yes.
yes,
Yeah.
for sure.
Okay, so to wrap this up, is there anything else you want to share with our audience about the cloud or the cloud fundamentals course?
I mean, one is that if you have worked with the cloud or haven't worked with the cloud, but feel a little bit fuzzy about things, and just want to cement the foundational understanding of how the cloud works and what it means to you as a data professional, like a little bit of a sell for the course. The other thing that I'll say very vaguely, because I can't be too specific, is that if you are interested in getting your hands a little bit dirtier with this stuff, there may be some additional cloud related materials coming out in some frame in the future. I'll keep it vague, but just keep your eye out here for more on the cloud because we know that this is an area of interest for our students, and seeing the popularity of this course early on has kind of cemented that for us as well.
Well, overall, I'll say I'm very excited about this new cloud course, this new format of the shorter courses. I think it's just a really effective way to learn quickly. And for everyone who hasn't checked it out yet, you can find the Cloud Fundamentals course on Maven Analytics or Udemy. Again, thanks for your time, Chris. It was nice chatting with you.
It's a pleasure as always.